I do want to just get into that, and really quickly, for those of you who don't know HL7, HL7 is the international body that's organizing healthcare data and attempting to standardize it, and it goes back to the 70s. Maybe not HL7, but the idea of creating standards. And this slide has a lot of things, but really, there's what I want you to remember is that FHIR is like the fourth iteration of that. And this is what version 3 looked like. From my experience, half of the hospitals are in version 2, which is a very simple message being sent from one doctor to the other. And then when they came to version 3, they decided to create this thing called reference information model, which you see now is not simple. It's not simple at all, actually. Try to basically represent the whole experience of a hospital. And so what we started seeing in at least in US hospitals is that each hospital has its own reference information model, which of course defies the point completely. And then enter FHIR now. FHIR is the latest standard, and it's I think the main premise, Rian, is this idea of FHIR being simple, right? And FHIR being this is the graphic that the designers did for us. It's like FHIR being, I like to think of it again as like Lego blocks, right? Like I had a lot of, I was a Lego addict when I was a kid. So maybe it's my bias, but this idea that, FHIR is based on resources that I can only send you this resource called patient or observation or clinician, provider. And like these resources are all you need. So it's like boiling it down to kind of like the most common 80% rather than trying to get to like the obscure 20%. But from that perspective and historical perspective, I wanted to ask you, like, what does FHIR? What was the impetus for FHIR, and what makes FHIR great? Like, what makes FHIR? What makes us all so hopeful that this is the answer to interoperability compared to the previous standards?
Yeah. So okay, first of all, it's the best answer so far, and it's a better answer than previous answers, I guess. Although, don't forget that when you look at HL7, the most successful standard, which is still very much in place, is V2. Mm-hmm. So that's the version 2 standard, which was like sort of an EDI-like standard. But the nice thing about FHIR is that it's bringing something to healthcare that's been very successful in other industries, and that is the API. Mm-hmm. More specifically, what we call the RESTful API, the REST API, which is technology, and I don't want to go into the technology, but what you have to keep in mind is, I guess, that the API, well, you remember, maybe some of the of the people in the audience may remember that back in the day when we had the first versions of the World Wide Web, when you had this amazing thing where you had web pages, and in a web page you have a link, and you click on the link, and what happens? Another web page appears, and this web page, it might be on another machine in a different country, created by a different person, and the whole meaning of it is that because on that web page you also have a link, a hyperlink, remember, and you can click on that link. We're totally used to this mechanism, but back in the day it was a miracle that you have all these pieces of information who were interconnected. And I think the foundation of the internet and the language that was common for the World Wide Web to happen was HTML, right? So all these documents with the links connected the HTML pages. Now, when I think the API, the REST API, uses the same foundation that the internet is built on, not to connect documents, but to connect actual software systems, to connect databases. Yeah. And that's what the API is really doing. So the amazing thing is that you now have databases across the World Wide Web, across the internet, databases, software systems that can actually connect through these APIs. And that's a technical trick. You don't need to know the mechanics of the API the RESTful API, but the economic importance is that you all of a sudden have computer systems talking to each other, that you have apps being able to retrieve data from software systems, which is what happens if you, for instance, I always like to use the example of Google Maps. Now, Google Maps has an API, you don't know about it, but it's being used all over the world in millions of apps just to retrieve data about a location. And that's the API. And look at what it's done. It's enabled, for instance, food delivery, right? There's a whole new branch of companies, a new industry that evolved around the concept of APIs. And this has been going on in all sorts of industries. And now FHIR has brought this concept of the API, of interconnecting systems, like the system of the pharmacy, the system of the GP, the hospital, the lab, the app here, the patient app, connects all these systems through APIs so they can communicate. And that's, I think, the major achievement, is that FHIR has brought this existing technology, which is the RESTful API, to healthcare.